Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Seth Lewis, and on behalf of Harvard University Division of Science, the Harvard Library, and the Harvard Bookstore, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment in our Book Talk lecture series. I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's event with Nicole Rust, who's presenting her book, Elusive Cures: Why Neuroscience Hasn't Solved Brain Disorders and How We Can Change That. Before we dive into the book, a few updates on our series. There are two events next month. On November 3rd, Steve Ramirez joins us to discuss his book, How to Change a Memory, One Neuroscientist's Quest to Alter the Past. And on November 18th, John Huth presents his latest, A Sense of Space, A Local's Guide to a Flat Earth, the Edge of the Cosmos, and Other Curious Places. For more information and to stay up to date on all things Harvard Science Book Talks, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Our event tonight will consist of a brief presentation from our speaker, followed by a discussion with our interlocutor, Kellyanne. And then there will be time for audience questions, and when that concludes, we will then have book signing. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Nicole Rust is professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, recipient of the Troland Award for the National Academy of Sciences. She is a contributing editor at The Transmitter, a leading brain research news magazine. Joining her in conversation tonight is Kellyanne Cornick, my bad, I forgot her last name. Kellyanne received her bachelor's in science from Rochester Institute of Technology, studying soft condensed matter physics and the philosophy of cognition. Since beginning graduate work at Harvard, she's moved between experimental and theoretical works in biophysics-related fields, from the physics of how viruses assemble themselves to modeling genetics and evolution. She enjoys working with messy problems and complex systems that keep her in close contact with other disciplines. We have a lot to learn this evening, so without further ado, I'm delighted to turn the stage over to you two. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to Harvard Bookstore for having me, and to everyone who was involved in organizing this. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's just such a pleasure to be here. So yeah, tonight I am happy to tell you about 5 insights I had while writing this book, Elusive Cures. Before I dive in, I just want to begin by acknowledging that this is a complex time for science in the United States. And I know that the Harvard community has been hit particularly hard. So part of what I'm hoping to do tonight is to hold up brain research as an example of what it is that we scientists writ large are fighting for in our quest to do research that will meet society's needs. In the case of brain research, it also is really clear what's at stake. And that is not just millions, but billions of people who are suffering from brain and mental conditions of many different types. And the story I want to tell today is ultimately optimistic, because I really do think that we are on the cusp of some amazing breakthroughs following new developments in artificial intelligence and biotechnology. But I also want to confess that I did not begin writing this book from a place of optimism. I actually started writing this book quite pessimistic. And that was because I was hearing a lot of murmuring from the heads of our funding agencies and elsewhere that researchers like myself and what we had been discovering wasn't aligning quite right with what society really needs from us. And so that set me off on a path of exploration, trying to piece all these things together. And so these insights, as I unfold them, I want to take you along that journey from pessimism, that place I started, to the optimism that I discovered. Now, before I dive in, I just want to say a few words about the words I'll be using tonight. And I want to acknowledge that for some of these conditions we're going to be talking about, like autism and ADHD and depression, there are individuals who have been diagnosed with them who do not believe they have a condition. They see themselves as having a form of neurodiversity that society has wrongly become intolerant to. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that. When I use the term, and my preferred term is condition, I'm really using that from an empathetic place, because while that is true, at the same time there are other individuals who have been diagnosed with these conditions who really do want and need treatment. For example, an individual who has ADHD who might suffer from insomnia and wants help. And so when I use the term condition, that's really what I'm referring to, that we want to have a suite of things to offer individuals who want treatment that are better than we have today. So diving in, this book, where did it start? Like I said, I was hearing these murmurings from the heads of funding agencies that what researchers like myself have been discovering about the brain is disconnected from what we need. And that is a type of understanding of the brain and mind around which we can shape treatments and cures for brain and mental conditions of all types. Just to give you an example of that, there are many examples, but I just want to give you one. It's this quote. And it's a little bit long, but it's so powerful, and it was such an inspiration when I wrote this book. I want to read it to you. So this is Tom Insel, and Tom Insel was the head of one of the institutes of the National Institute of Health. He was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And during his 13 years there, he oversaw a budget of $20 billion to distribute to research. When he stepped down after those 13 years, this is what he said. I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, or improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. When I read this quote, it was a gut punch to me as a brain researcher. $20 billion and 13 years across the entire community didn't even move the needle. So I was just left wondering, what's it going to take? Moreover, if the heads of our funding agencies don't have the answers to this question, then who's going to answer it? So this was the type of pessimism I started with when I started writing Elusive Cures, asking myself the question, as a brain researcher, I need to be able to answer the question, what is it going to take? And so as I unfold these insights, as you'll see, they do unfold from that pessimistic place into a much more optimistic one. Now, the first insight, I began by asking myself, so how does this work? How has this worked historically? If we look at the therapies that we have today, what were the big breakthroughs in brain research that led to them? And it turns out that many of our current therapies actually have a history behind them that isn't a launch from understanding the brain. It came from somewhere else. In some cases, these are very old therapies that existed before we understood much about the brain at all. And often, these were serendipitously, accidentally discovered. One example is the first antidepressant. It was discovered as part of the clinical trials for TB, the lung-infecting bacteria tuberculosis. During those TB clinical trials, they noticed that the patients seemed to be really joyous. So here's a picture from Life magazine in the 1950s of those patients dancing around. And so they realized, wow, maybe this drug has a different purpose. They then put it through clinical trials for depression, and it was approved by the FDA in 1958. Another example are very effective, but also tend to be addictive pain drugs, the opioids like OxyContin. Those are actually an ancient remedy that dates back to the ancient Mesopotamians in 3400 BCE. It's the extracting opium from a poppy plant. OxyContin is simply a slow-release form of a drug called oxycodone, which we first synthesized from opium in 1910, long before we understood much about the brain at all. And perhaps one of my favorite examples, Ritalin, also called methylphenidate. So that was developed in the 1940s, again, before we knew much about how the brain works. It was developed by a chemist using an approach I call try it and see what happens. Thankfully, we don't do much of this anymore. But the chemist, he synthesized it. He tried it on himself. He liked it. He gave some to his wife. His wife liked it too. It really helped her tennis game. Get this, his wife's name was Rita. And so he named it after her. That's why Ritalin is called Ritalin. Yeah. So these are all examples, and there are many more examples of contemporary drugs that were developed much before we knew anything much about the brain at all, and certainly were not developed following a big breakthrough that led to a new therapy. So you might ask, well, have brain researchers done anything useful? Have they contributed anyway? And the answer is absolutely they have. And that brings me to my second insight. When there is a big discovery that leads to a new therapy, that development story tends to be absolutely epic. So let me tell you the story about this drug for insomnia. It's called suvorexant. So to understand how suvorexant works, you need to understand that there are chemicals in our brain that are released during the day to keep us awake. And the rationale behind suvorexant is that some of our brains release too much of these chemicals or release the chemicals for too long. And so the goal of suvorexant is to block the activity of these keep you awake chemicals. The development of suvorexant dates back to 1998 when these keep you awake chemicals were first discovered in the brain. They're called the orexins. When they were first discovered, researchers thought that they were involved in eating, not sleep. But then they were tied to sleep soon later when they were tied to narcolepsy. So researchers were studying a form of narcolepsy in dogs where it's genetically inherited. So these dogs, like humans, they spontaneously fall asleep during the day. And so researchers were trying to figure out what was going on in these dogs, and they discovered that it was part of the pathway by which this keep you awake chemical works. Soon after, these orexins were linked to human narcolepsy, which is not genetically inherited, but it happens when the neurons, the brain cells that release this chemical degenerate, presumably due to a neuroimmune attack. Upon discovering that there are chemicals in our brain that keep us awake, which nobody really understood before, the pharmaceutical industry proceeded to try to find chemicals that block them. Again, the idea that some of us are releasing these chemicals too much or too long. This included Merck, which screened over 2 million chemicals to find just the right one. And once they found one, they refined it further to enhance its efficacy and reduce its side effects. That was suvorexant. It entered clinical trials in 2007, and it was approved by the FDA in 2014. So altogether, this was many years of research in academia, followed by the pharmaceutical industry. It took 16 years and cost over $1 billion to develop. So it's just an example of how a big breakthrough in understanding the brain can lead to a new therapy that we've never had before. It's an epic discovery story. And discovery stories like that, this is not unique. In recent years, we've seen drugs introduced that have been game-changing for individuals with migraines, postpartum depression, pain, and epilepsy, all like suvorexant, built on a new discovery that led to a new therapy. So given that's true, you might be wondering, well, what's Tom Insel so worried about, and what's Nicole Rust writing a book about? The answer is that there are other classes of disorders for which the field has been a little bit befuddled. They include the psychiatric conditions like depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, where we do have treatments. They do not work for everyone, and many of these treatments were discovered before we knew much about the brain at all, or they're derivatives of treatments that were discovered during that time. We don't really understand what's causing them or what's happening in the brain. They also include our neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS, where we do have therapies, for example, for Parkinson's, but we don't have effective ways to slow the neurodegeneration that's leading to the decline. And the neurodevelopmental conditions like forms of intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder, where we really don't understand what causes them, and we don't understand what's happening in the brain. And so the question when I was writing Elusive Cures I wanted to ask and answer is how are we going to tackle these disorders that really have proven to be elusive? And that leads me to my third insight. This one took a long time for me to arrive at. So this book took me years to write. I wrote it, I ripped it up, I threw it away, I wrote it again until I felt like I really could be optimistic about what I was saying. And this insight is that we've been thinking about the brain in the wrong way insofar as we've been oversimplifying it. Thinking about something like, and this started back in the 1990s, a big long chain of causes that lead to effects. And so this really begins in our genes. Our genes are what are used to create our brain cells. It's the activity of those brain cells that gives rise to all the amazing things we can do, like see and remember, imagine, move. When you think about the brain that way, as a series of causes that lead to effects, When you're trying to think about what its dysfunction might be, it really amounts to looking for a break and a link in that chain that's responsible. And so brain researchers would search for those links that are broken and then try to go in and repair them. In the case of a mutated gene, it might be a drug. In the case of a brain area that has aberrant activity, the solution might be a form of stimulation. And this type of approach really, was effective for some disorders, and for other disorders, it seemed not to be so effective. What's exciting is what's happening in the field today, where researchers are really beginning to realize that that is a massive oversimplification of the brain, which is often held up as the most complex thing in the known universe. Long chains of causes to effects are really not so complicated, even if there are many stacks. So what is so complicated about the brain? The brain is actually chock full of feedback loops at all levels, not just causes that lead to effects, but causes that lead to effects that feed back on themselves as causes. If a brain area, A, sends information to B, B sends information back to A again. We see these loops in genetic networks. We see them in our interactions between ourselves and our environment, which feed back to wire how our brains are feedback to rewire how our brains are wired up. That's learning. And why this is so important is because when you have systems with these loops, they don't behave like domino chains. They don't break like chains. These are dynamical systems. And we know a lot about these because we've studied them in so many other contexts, like the weather and ecosystems and nuclear reactors and the International Space Station. One of their special properties is they can have surprising emergent properties that are hard to predict just by studying the different links in a chain. The reason that this is so important brings us to insight 4, which is the most profound insight I had when writing the book. And that is, in our quest to create treatments and cures, the challenge that we're up against is absolutely formidable. And appreciating this requires understanding that when you think about a treatment, you're trying to take a brain or a mind that's in what you regard as a less healthy state and shift it toward health. Engineers, they would call that a control problem. I like to call it a form of benevolent control. These dynamical systems, they are infamously hard to control in meaningful ways. Case in point, we cannot control the weather. We cannot dissipate a hurricane, we cannot redirect a hurricane, and it's not for lack of trying. If you look back in the 1940s, the end goal of weather research was control. You can read about it in Elusive Cures. It's a fascinating history. Researchers wanted to control the weather, not just to dissipate hurricanes, but even to weaponize it. This is a picture of John von Neumann standing in front of one of the first computers that he built. Part of the purpose of that computer was weather control. In the 1940s, the government tried to control the weather. It did not end well. One example is Project Cirrus in 1947. There was a hurricane that was forecast to keep going out at sea. It was off the coast of Georgia, keep going out at sea. And so they thought, what can it hurt if we just mess with it a little bit? We'll try. They dumped a bunch of dry ice onto this hurricane, and the worst possible thing happened. It was supposed to keep going out to the Atlantic. It did a 130-degree hairpin turn and landed right on the coast of Georgia with much destruction. Fast forward, after many attempts, we realized dynamical systems are really, really hard to control in purposeful ways. We understand exactly why that's true for the weather now. It's a chaotic system. And so we can ask ourselves, well, what makes us think we can even control the brain? And there is hope. And the reason is because the brain is different than the weather insofar as the brain has developed ways to control itself, these naturally evolved ways. Like if I snap my fingers, you might wake up. That's part of your arousal system. It's part of the way your brain wakes itself up. We also have ways to put you to sleep. That's just one example of a control system in the brain. And it's those nodes that we, as brain researchers, really need to tap into. So it really kind of redefines the problem. We're not looking for broken links in the chain. We're looking for the brain's control nodes. The final thing I want to say is my final insight. We can be optimistic that our next steps will be impactful, not because these are new ideas. These are old ideas. The idea of a brain as a complex system. Just want to put up some nods here to the luminaries. So all of these individuals have made important contributions to thinking about the brain this way, including the one labeled 1981, that's John Hopfield, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contribution. He won that in 2024. So what's new? What's new is the technology. For the first time in history, we have the technology to make the measurements that we need in order to study the brain in this way. The special properties of dynamical systems happen due to interactions between their parts. That means you have to measure their parts all at the same time, not one at a time. 20 years ago, I measured the activity of brain cells one at a time. Today, we can measure 1 million simultaneously. It's exploding. We also have new breakthroughs in machine learning and artificial intelligence that are helping us fit and evaluate the quantitative approaches that we need to understand this data. So just to wrap up, I started this book project as kind of a personal journey for me. I started pessimistic as a brain researcher because I could not see the through line between what we were doing and what society needs from us. And I ended up optimistic because now I can. I understand why it is that treating some brain and mental conditions is so incredibly formidable. I believe that for the first time in history, we're ready to face those challenges head on. And I think it's really dangerous to overpromise. I think we have to be careful about that. But I can honestly say I am optimistic that we will be better able to help the millions of individuals that are suffering in the next 2 decades than we have in the past. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a clear outline. Oh, covered a lot. Fantastic. Okay, so first, permit me a note before a question. It is a note of praise. I hope you permit that as well. So this book is, you talked about showed 7 luminaries, but this book is a tribute to the dedicated work and extraordinarily wide views of tens of thousands of scientists. You talk about just the size of the yearly gathering of brain scientists on the order of 30,000.
Yeah, 30,000 a year.
To our yearly March meeting of physicists, but tens of thousands of scientists. And those are only the people who are going to those meetings. So there's tens and tens of thousands of scientists, decades. And your clear love for the scientific community and scientific process in its most tedious work at the bench and its grand moments when it all works out and you really hit on something. It's clear throughout. And this is much a book about the science of the brain as it is about brain scientists, the history of science, the methodology of science, science communication to wider audiences, science communication between scientists in lectures and conferences. And as a fellow scientist, I want to thank you for such a lovely account of really the whole of scientific activity. And it was a lovely survey.
Wow, well, thank you for that note. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to emphasize that when I wrote Elusive Cures, my goal wasn't to swoop in as some sort of genius, explain how we're gonna solve all of this, because I don't believe that's how science works. And as you've channeled so eloquently, I think science progresses as a community. And so when I thought about writing this book, I really thought about, brain research happens here in the weeds. It's all the ask and answers of every project, that we go through. But this was an opportunity to zoom out and try to understand how all the pieces connect. So I was really acting almost like a science journalist or a curator, trying to channel the genius of this era, as opposed to, swooping in and trying to solve everything. So thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. And speaking of initiating this project as an act of writing, which also I think you see writing about science as a legitimate act of doing science and as a feedback loop with the projects of everyday science work at the bench in your metaphor of bench to
bedside.
Yeah. Bedside, thank you. I want to talk more about how this book started, how you decided that this would be a book, finding your audience here, and possibly the stigma of senior scientists writing trade books. I think a lot of scientists are seeing the climate in science right now and kind of the news about science funding, and I think a lot of scientists are getting geared up to think, maybe I should write something. Maybe I should get over my biases that people who want to write books just want to be famous, or they're not serious. If they're writing books, they couldn't possibly be serious research scientists. So I think this book is a lovely, I think it does not fall into those stereotypes very clearly. And I want you to talk more about the origin of this book.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. The origin of the book. Yes. When I set out to write the book, it was, as I described it in part, it was a personal exercise. I had some questions I wanted to ask and answer for myself. Before this book, I hadn't done a lot of public-facing communication. And one thing I realized is that the issues at play here, they're really conceptual more than they are technical. And so it is something that I think is accessible to a broad audience. It also is something that, everyone either is impacted by some type of brain or mental condition, or a loved one close to them is. So I think it's like of universal interest about the solutions that are evolving. But one of the biggest joys that I discovered in writing was the insights that I had about the brain by zooming out and thinking about how all the pieces connect together, that in turn fed back and just transformed how I think about the type of thing the brain is and what causes its dysfunction. And so it was that feedback loop between writing in this broad, accessible way at this high level that then in turn has made me a better scientist. And so I have become such a proponent of scientists doing that as well. In terms of these complex times, I had no way of anticipating what these times would be. And so that's really serendipitous that I'm able to put a voice to some of these things in these complicated times. Yeah.
And through the personal exercise of this book, has it changed not just how you see your role as a communicator for science, both to the public and, as you call it, perspective neuroscience, the genre of writing a kind of perspective by a senior scientist about what's been going on in the field, and much more conceptual, as you were saying, than technical. But how has this changed the topics that you're interested in pursuing in your own technical scientific future?
Yeah, so it turns out that my CV up to this point is almost exclusively about domino chains. So I have spent the past decades of my career mapping how causes lead to effects and realizing that the genius of our era is really about these feedback loops. When I zoomed out to write Elusive Cures, I got to ask myself, okay, now where am I going to zoom back in on the other side of writing this book? And I really wanted to take on one of society's big unmet needs. And I realized how little we really understand in the psychiatric space. So before this book, I used to study seeing and remembering. And now I am redirecting my research program to study the neuroscience of mood in order to help fill in some of those gaps. And I've chosen mood in part because it is a system with these big feedback loops. So it turns out that our moods, like how happy we are, they're really a kind of a running average of the goodness and badness of things that have happened to us. But then how we perceive what happens to us in turn is impacted by our moods. So our moods are an average of our perceptions, but then our perceptions feedback. And so we have this big loop here, and there are lots of questions about how do we even take that on. And so we really do need to shift to thinking about it like the weather or ecology or something. And so I'm really excited to embrace those ideas. Yeah.
Fantastic. So speaking of changing in turns, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the process of writing this book changed your mind on the use of complex system science, and especially to yourself. And a little bit of it on a personal note, when I started my own work on complex system causality, and in my own endeavors to kind of rid ourselves of domino chain thinking and think in terms of more networks and webs and various different kind of metaphors, I was kind of skeptical that all we were going to be doing was taking metaphors out and sticking them back in. And that as if we just chanted webs, not chains enough, that would somehow, if we just chanted that to ourselves, that we would get somewhere and that we'd have some revelations. But then really digging into what we kind of needed to solve these kinds of problems, specifically of things like cognition in the brain and broader things like ecology, I think I eventually was convinced that changing those metaphors isn't just a plug in and plug out kind of process, that it really does, that kind of precision thinking exercise really helps you reorient things. So I wanted to give you some space to talk more about how your mind was changed. It sounds, you wrote in the book that your kind of early encounters with complexity science were with my own community physicists, and we are stereotypically prone to things like oscillators and networks and power laws, and we have our own biases. We want to think that everything in an ecology or whatever has a power law scaling, and we're prone to aesthetics.
Yes, you do.
And so those are our own overlooked generalizations that, as a community, we need to seriously think about.
Yeah.
But how did you move past those initial impressions?
Yeah.
Of physicists loving oscillators on networks, which I'm of course biased to think are absolutely beautiful. But how did you move past those initial biases and come to really become a champion of this viewpoint?
That's a great question. For me, it was zooming out, seeing at a very high level how this new way of thinking is enabling us to measure things we've never been able to measure before. So watching that community who has been so enamored with power laws and scaling turn that type of thinking into measurements. So being able to measure whether someone who is in a coma is a locked-in patient, whether they actually have consciousness in there or not, using measurements based on complexity theory, or being able to measure how sleep restored a brain actually is. And it was that excited me, the idea that we are entering an era of measuring things that will be relevant for the most formidable of these conditions. That really convinced me we're on the right track.
I also enjoy that here as kind of I think it's also part of scientific practice to think about the ways in which you're overgeneralizing or the subtleties. And I think this book has a careful balance between, you've definitely read a lot of philosophy of science and history of science, and you definitely deploy it very fluidly when is needed, and then you put it away when the technicality does not suit the project anymore, which I really appreciate. And I think that's helpful for somebody like me who probably could get too much in the weeds about what specifically about the nature of causality. And so I think that helped me get out of my own weeds, which I think is very, very helpful. But also there's a tendency to, especially with a new framework, I think it's going to be some magic bullet that we'll have figured it all out, we make this replacement, and then we'll have all the breakthroughs and all be over. So spoilers for chapter 9. I hope you get there. You warn against these magic bullets explicitly. You know that many fields for decades have adopted these things. We've talked about food webs versus food chains, et cetera. Hopfield has been working on this stuff for decades. Complexity science isn't new. The Santa Fe Institute for Complexity is many decades old. And you say usefully that principles are beneficial, but magic bullets are reckless. And I wanted you to talk more about this balancing act to resist overgeneralization in finding this tough path forward. And we have this optimism. We really want to, like I too, as a physicist, you talk about the knife's edge of self-organized criticality, as a physicist would call it. And part of me wonders that, in generations in the future, will I think, that was a little optimistic. That was a little overgeneralized. There's a lot of conversation in the complexity community, as you well know, about, will brains teach us more about other forms of connected hierarchical feedback systems? And it's hard to tell what we'll be able to generalize, but there's a great deal of optimism that'll move us forward on some very difficult problems.
Yeah, these are such deep questions, and I just...
Sorry, that was many, many questions.
No,
as well.
I so admire the depth at which you've thought about these things, especially as a graduate student. I just really admire this a lot. Yeah, I think that as scientists, we are eager to find principles, right, that will apply broadly. We're eager to adopt tools that will help us with the problem at hand. And the thing we have to be careful about is, overgeneralizing in a way that we understand one thing, and so we kind of superimpose it on something else, and it's the wrong way to think about that particular problem. That is the danger. Reframing these issues, I think it's very difficult when the end goal is to understand, because that means so many different things to so many people, and it's something that scientists have been struggling, with forever. Part of it is personal taste, and part of it is
could I pause? Could you talk about give an example of, because you did it lovely and concretely, and this book is delightfully concrete, and about what one neuroscientist might think of as understanding versus what another neuroscientist might think is understanding.
Yeah, there are all these great examples of, for example, what does it mean to understand color, right? And so for some individuals, understanding color is about the molecules and how light and wavelengths, it's about the biophysics. And for other individuals, it's about understanding the conscious percept of the redness of red and whether my red is your red, right? Which are two totally different ways to understand things. Fast forwarding to the end goal of I started this project as a foundational researcher. I very much believe in basic research. I think that is the bottleneck to society's end goals. At the same time, framing some of those societal end goals and working back to fill in the knowledge that's missing. It's a new way of for me to think about foundational research, and it's one I'm really excited about deploying, because then everything becomes a lot more concrete, right? It's not really about differences in taste. It's about, there is a problem that needs to be solved, and it's all hands on deck. We might parallel process, we might try different solutions, but there's something concrete that we need to solve, so let's go solve it. Yeah.
You have this story, I think it was at a workshop in the book, about giving a talk and being asked about nitpicky things about methodology. I think you'd probably tell the story.
Yeah, this was actually, it was in a robotics engineering workshop. And so they brought in a team of brain researchers to tell them about the latest in brain research. And I was there as somebody who understood about how we see and we recognize objects. And the idea was that I was there to kind of motivate some of the engineers to build robots to solve that same challenge. And so, so when there were, I think, a small group of us, and when I got up to give my talk, another researcher interrupted me several times to argue with me about, what's the evidence for your claim, and what's the validity, what's the interpretation. And at the end of my talk, a student raised his hand and said, I am so disappointed because that professor was so rude and they interrupted you so often. You didn't get to finish your talk, and I just really wanted to hear what you had to say. And I was kind of shocked because I felt like our interaction was quite normal because, we're trying to figure out something really, really hard. But it turned out that after the student said that, the entire class broke out clapping. I was just dumbfounded. And the reason is because engineers, I realized at this workshop, they just take a very different perspective. They didn't spend a lot of time in their talks talking about the validity of their assumptions. They were building something, and everything was a lead up to the demo, right? So they didn't have to talk about, is it valid or not, because at the end you'd see it for yourself. The robot would work or it wouldn't work, right? So it was just show. And it was very insightful for me as a foundational researcher to think about that very pragmatic end goal and how powerful it can be as an illustration of understanding.
Yeah, and I enjoyed in the book how you treated it as, with a kind of characteristic even-handedness, as a foundational scientist, these kinds of arguments over taste and methodology are part of what really helps keep science rigorous. And science is not a thing that you do in a room by yourself and then you just present to people. You're always talking to people, double-checking things, people will point things out, you might disagree, sometimes it'll come down to matters of taste, sometimes they really lash onto something important, and sometimes you have to sit and be like, okay, what is this actually important for the thing that I want to do? And sometimes it just comes down to matters of taste. But I really enjoyed how you kind of cut a nice balance between, yes, there is some goal orientation, but then also these kinds of nitty-gritty conversations. There's a reason they're normalized between scientists. They're part of, we view them as getting some stuff done.
Yes.
They are productive work. I mean, sometimes just talking is just talking, but I think those conversations, you are doing something very productive. So I enjoyed, it felt like kind of a double parable. That too much kind of goal orientation. We don't care how we got there. We got a thing that works, and that's the proof is in the pudding. Can't always get us there. That's kind of the trying things and it works and it doesn't really matter it works.
You can't just assert you want to solve depression and then make it happen. Yeah.
And then sometimes you need to do the slower, methodical things and really talk out the nitty-gritty things until you get to such small things that you just completely disagree on taste, which is going to happen between as many neuroscientists and physicists and any kind of scientist in the world is going to have their different set of tastes.
Thank you.
And we're all permitted our taste, so it will make those conversations really fun. Okay, so There was a particular technical term in here that I hope the audience will permit that I want to talk a little bit more, and that's called epistemic iteration. So reframing things in these new conceptual frameworks in this book acts to not just provide us with clear heads with which to formulate new ways of measuring things and describing things and hopefully understanding things. They're also kind of an exercise in humility as practicing scientists, because you realize that in the future, you're going to look at our current ways of thinking as we look upon theories of the past, because we have some considerable advantages over the past in which we have more, we have very concrete and very advanced scientific apparatuses of theory and methodology and computation. But we're not giving the old generations enough credit where it's due, is they had no idea what depression is. No idea where to start. So I want to talk about epistemic iteration and how that, this is part of, I think, your optimistic turn to this as well. As scientists, we could be like, well, we don't know what depression is. We don't even know how to start. There are so many hundreds of measures of depression, and there are so many different causes, biological, environmental, genetic, everything that could possibly contribute to a person being depressed, that how do we even start to figure out what this thing is? And I think the process of epistemic iteration is this nice optimistic turn that helps give us some optimism.
Yeah, that's so well said. Yes, so I think for me, it was one of these moments where you don't even know some of the assumptions that you bring to the table until you try to spell them out. And I realized that part of my pessimism was kind of a misunderstanding about how science evolves and makes progress. So yeah, I would show up at this meeting, decade after decade with 30,000 scientists, and I would be like, we're still asking the same questions about the same parts of the brain. This feels like we're not going anywhere. And it was because I was misunderstanding what it was that we were doing. This idea of epistemic iteration, I first learned about it in a book by the philosopher Hasek Chang, and it's called Inventing Temperature, and it's a brilliant book that I recommend to everyone. So he goes back and he reviews the history of how did we go from a sense of hot and cold to understanding temperature to the degree to which we could create thermodynamics and statistical mechanics over the course of 250 years. And he argues that process, it's complicated because once you understand temperature, you know exactly how to measure it, but you need measurements to create understanding, and you need understanding to create measurements. So how do you even begin? And the argument is we have to just jump in with our best guess. And hopefully it will be close enough that we can get there as long as we commit to iterating our measurements and our theories to get closer and closer to the truth. And that just made me realize that that's what we've been doing in brain research. It's not that we ask new sets of questions, it's that we refine the answers to them to get closer and closer to what we really need. And so yes, in the case of depression, I think that we are today with depression probably where we were with temperature 250 years ago, right? We have a sense of what depression is. We have some very crude thermometer-like depression scales. Once we understand depression, we'll know exactly how to measure it, right? But again, we need measurements to create understanding. So how did they get there with temperature? Well, the first thing that they did is they had some kind of crude thermometers, and they said, well, we need all the thermometers to measure the same thing in the same way, even if we don't understand. We need them all calibrated, right? So they'll at least all make the same measurement. And we see that today in depression research, where there are over 250 scales for depression, 250 ways to measure depression. And so a committee got together in 2019 and said, well, we need to agree on some small number of scales so at least we can all measure the same things, right? So that's a good start. And yeah, we just have to be committed to creating theories about it and refining those theories and moving forward and asking, from that high level, how are we going to get there? We're going to iterate our way there. And so when I get overwhelmed in this new field that I study, which is mood and depression research, I keep coming back to that. Well, we got there with temperature, and we're going to get there with depression too. And so, yeah, we just have to talk about how we're going to iterate. That makes me feel confident in a way that I wouldn't have been a decade or so ago.
Yeah, no, I think as a scientist, I like to tell my own students when teaching, when we're talking, when you're teaching, you're also not just teaching the material, but the scientific process, what it means to be a scientist, is that there are really no sunk costs. we like to joke that, you do an experiment and your yeast get contaminated and then you're struck from the bottom and then you go back up. And then, especially in experimentalism, it can feel like you have sunk costs, but there are no sunk costs. No matter what you have done, you have moved forward, you've iterated on something. You have at least closed off a path that you now know that is not to go down before. I think reading that made me feel, I think it's important, especially to trainees, undergrads, people new to science, graduate students, that this kind of ill-defined, we don't know even what we're measuring yet, is a jumping off point. And we're already, I can't say halfway there, but we're a good way there. We've been doing decades of fantastic, cool work. So I don't think it is that we've just been running on a treadmill and going nowhere. We have been iterating and iterating. So I don't think the answer is just one more model or one more questionnaire about depression symptoms. But I think those different 200 definitions, they haven't gotten us nowhere.
I would agree with that. I also think that there is value in asking, what is the genius of the next era going to be? And I think it's safe to say it's not going to be the 251st questionnaire.
Absolutely not.
It's going to be these new breakthroughs in our ability to measure things like in the brain we've never been able to measure before, right? And so I think, tapping into the genius of the ethos of this era is a really great way to point one's compass. Yeah, so thoughtfulness about it. But I completely agree with you that let's learn from the past, not just kind of blindly go with the inertia.
If anyone has any questions, I saw one right up here.
So on the problem of measurement, there are these lab-grown mini brains that are supposed to at least emulate the complexity of a fetus. Do you think that that is a good pathway to improve measurements in the brain, given how delicate it is to measure the brain in vivo?
So you're talking about the organoids. I think that we have no idea what is and isn't going to work, and in some senses, it's kind of all hands on deck. And one could imagine and appreciate all the things that the organoids will be good for. Understanding something more complicated than just isolated cells in a dish, they have some three-dimensional structure. I think that that's great. I also think we can reason through that if we want to study things like mental health, maybe we should have something that's mental. And so I think it's natural to presume that they won't be the only thing that we need. So I think they'll be part of the solution, but not the entirety of it.
Hi, thank you for that lovely conversation. I go to school at Northeastern. I'm a fifth-year neuroscience student, so I've been kind of new to the field, very new. And my question is more so about the research finding conversation that we kind of alluded to. You said something interesting where you were like, overgeneralization is, you said something, it's a loose bullet or something like that. My question is, what's the balance? Like, what's a good spot to be in where something is not an isolated kind of small group finding that is not generalizable versus something that's, this is just not true type of thing for a lot of people? Where's that balance, and what do you think of that middle spot?
Oh, yeah, it's such a difficult question to answer. I think the field benefits so much from the diversity of perspectives and the diversity of comfort in where that lives. Some individuals are oversimplifiers, some individuals are overcomplexifiers, some individuals live in the middle. I tend to be a simplifier, and I think that's what allows me to write a book like this, like a very conceptual, high level. I don't get caught too much in the weeds. But I appreciate we need a lot of, I do research too in the weeds, but we need people who are really, bothered by the inconsistency between those two things and the fact that model is wrong. So I think we need all types. There is no one right answer to that question. And then it's really like, what is it that you want that understanding for? You know, at the end of the day, if the end goal is to understand and treat brain and mental conditions, we need enough simplification that's going to lead to a therapy, right? So it can't be super, super technical, but it also has to work, right? So I'm sorry, I can't give a more concrete one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think it so much depends. Yeah.
Hi, I mostly became aware of you after you started your foray in emotions and were active on Blue Sky. And I think you're one of the most collegial people that I have seen on that website.
Thank you.
And I was curious what you think of the value of more confrontational approaches that you usually don't seem to take. And you're very kind, very warm, even when people are disagreeing with you. And I'm curious how you approach that, or what do you think, if there is a value to more outright confrontation?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think on platforms like social media, so much can get misunderstood and heated so quickly. I also have the benefit of, I've been around for quite a long time, you know, so I have less to prove these days. But is there a role for confrontation? I think we can't suffer fools or the foolish, especially in spaces like mental health and psychiatric research. At the same time, I'm just, you know, I don't see why ego has to be so much of a part, so much of this, right? This is about truth and evidence and facts, and, you know, yeah, I can get emotional and heated, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And at the end of the day, the real thrill is the science, right? And the insights and the solutions. Thanks for asking.
Hi, good to see you up here in this context. Yeah, so I am in the neuro AI field, where oftentimes when you have I'm in the neuro AI field. I'm a trained neuroscientist, someone who is trying to better understand the brain by using the same lessons we learn from AI to apply to neuroscience problems. And one of the things that is, I think, of benefit from the AI field is this idea of task performance and objectives. An objective or an objective function allows someone to measure how well the model that you define, given like as much detail or as little detail as you want, is going to fulfill that objective to some degree. And I'm curious how you might be able to frame objectives for something like control problems. So thinking about recurrent neural networks is one way, or spiking neural networks is one way, but I'm just curious if in your thinking about like control, if objectives that are ethologically relevant to neuroscience, do they play nice to with each other? Do you think that's something that you have seen out there? And how might this map to an idea of state or phenotypes, perhaps? For example, if you have a neural network, how do you know if a neural network is in a high energy state where it's like say epilepsy, for example, or something even more, in my mind, abstract, like how do you have a model for depression in a neural network, for example? What kind of objective would you define for being able to measure anything that has to do with depression? So I don't know. This might be a mess of a question.
No, it's not a mess of a question. It's a really great, I guess what I would say is, you know, I can appreciate what you're pointing to, and that is a whole swath of brain research is trying to understand how the healthy brain functions, like how it sees and how it remembers, has gained enormous traction by specifying the end goal that a model has to solve, like it has to recognize the objects out in the world, and then we train a computer model to solve it and we compare it to a brain. And that approach seems really powerful. So how could we then extend it to understand the brain in ways that might be more relevant to, say, mental health, right? And I think that that is a really, really great question. I don't have brilliant answers to it, but I think that some of the biggest steps in brain research will be by communities who have thus far been working kind of independently, mind melding, and that is a really big opportunity for one of them. And I know that this is very relevant to your next steps in research, and so I hope to see you do some of that mind melding. So thank you.
And this will be the final question.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you so much for doing it. So traditionally, we've, in the United States anyway, the model has been that basic science is typically done at the university level, and that science is independent and mechanistic without any specific therapeutic goal.
Yeah.
But when something then comes about, that we then transition it into the private sector. Under the current model, though, more and more the private sector is getting involved in these things. So based on your thesis, starting with Dr. Insel's statement that that we've failed in a certain way, is the current model what the Trump administration is trying to foist upon us, not perhaps a better solution, that we're going to do more in the private sector and have more be commercially, or with specific commercial entities being developed, right? Commercial products, if you will, right? Neuralink, for instance,
Yeah,
right? That
yeah.
Elon is basically just harvesting what everybody's done in the academy to try to leap to the head of the class.
Yeah. When I look back on the history, I see it a little bit in a different way. When I ask myself, well, why were we, and by we I include myself, why were we perseverating on these domino chains? Why weren't we embracing the complexity of the brain? Because I really do believe that that's what was impeding our progress towards some of these formidable conditions. And the answer was we were technology limited. We couldn't make the right measurements, and we couldn't build the right models to study the brain in this way. And that's why the era of Tom Insel at NIMH was held back. I don't think it's a problem with the model of academic, and I still think, the brain is still the most complex thing in the entire known universe. So I don't think we can say, I want to understand depression and then hand it to Musk company and he's going to figure out depression. I still think we need that foundational research, absolutely. I think we're ready to embrace more of the complexity at the academic level. I think that's what needs to happen. We need to fill up those nuts and bolts understanding of how the healthy brain functions in order to lay those foundations for its dysfunction.
And that my follow-up was going to be, given that you believe we're at the beginning of this 250-year, trek, that perhaps Tom Insel was too hard on himself.
I suspect he was a little bit too hard.
An enormous thank you to Nicole C. Rust and Kellyanne Cornick for speaking with us tonight.